These days, when people hear the term first-person shooter, many think of Overwatch, Apex Legends, Call of Duty, and depending on who you are, those games and franchises may conjure up some negative connotations. And I know a number of people with whom I share common tastes in gaming, but when I say that I love FPS games, they get a confused look on their face, but that's often because their frames of reference for the genre are very different than mine. When I talk about first-person shooters, I'm not talking Black Ops. I'm talking about the classics, like Doom, Blood, Powerslave, Duke Nukem, and even newer games like Dusk. The so-called boomer shooters. These are the antithesis of linear cover shooters. These games all ooze personality thanks to inspired art direction, diverse arsenals, interesting puzzles, clever enemy AI, maze-like level design, and fast, unbridled movement. And while I truly adore all the aforementioned id Tech and Build Engine games, none, for me, compares to the original 1996 Quake, my single favorite FPS game of all time. And I don't feel this way because of nostalgia, because I view the game through rose-colored lenses. I feel this way because to this day, there's no FPS game to me that is more fun, that feels better, whose framework is more interesting than Quake's. Quake, along with games like Blood, Doom 64, Duke Nukem 3D, these all fall into the if you know camp in my mind. Today, FPS games like these almost feel like semi-kept secrets, and I never contain my inner geek whenever I connect with another gamer who appreciates them as much as I do. Which is why for a while now, I've wanted to produce a proper love letter video to Quake. Now, if you haven't already, regardless of your gaming preferences, do yourself a favor, experience Quake for yourself, especially because Night Dive Studios, the masters of remastering retro shooters, facilitated a pretty excellent re-release of the game back in 2021 that's available on virtually every platform, even Nintendo Switch for just $10 US. In fact, if you haven't, pause this video, go do that right now, and then come back later, because I'm going deep. This is a retrospective in which I'm going to talk all things Quake, its infamous development history that caused an implosion/exodus within the original id Software team, along with all the good nitty-gritty stuff, weapons, enemies, speedrunning, specific levels, community content, online multiplayer, the art direction and soundtrack, and most importantly, feel. Because no other video game in the world feels quite like Quake. But that's enough throat clearing, let's take a trip into the underworld. If you don't know about id Software, well, you should, particularly the early days of the studio. These Texas-based, long-haired, Ferrari-driving, programming, and design nerd wonders created and released Wolfenstein 3D back in 1992, for all intents and purposes, the first modern FPS game. This game set the mold. That unmistakable gun-toting point of view, running and gunning through maze-like levels, carefully peppered with enemies. Well, to be fair, in some places I'm fairly certain the pepper shaker lid fell off entirely, but also important, in addition to enemies, the game's levels are packed full of sadistically hidden secrets that, in the early 90s, in order to find all of them, well, it required hours of this. Welcome to wall humping. Get used to it, we're going to be doing a lot of that around here. The following year, the id team, whose best-known members were programmer John Carmack and designer John Romero, leaned into technological innovation, refined the Wolfenstein formula, and gave the world Doom, the most important FPS game of all time, and still to this day, an all-around excellent gaming experience with no padding or BS, save for a few story cards. Doom is probably one of those few perfect games in gaming history. If you know, you know. If you don't, well, Doom is everything its reputation suggests it is and more. You're the Doom Marine, or Doom Guy, or later, the roid-raging Hulk known as the Doom Slayer, and you're humanity's last line of defense against the hordes of hell. Demons of all shapes and sizes are here, and you have one job: to kill them all. Shotgun them, chainsaw them, smash them to bits with your bare hands. Oh, and don't forget about this. There's no superlative that hasn't been used to describe this game, and it's worthy of them all. Id was so popular at the time, not just because they made a great game, but because Carmack designed its engine, id Tech 1, which would be licensed and iterated on for years to come. On top of that, id released Doom's source code to the public. I mean, think about that by today's standards. Here you go, have fun with our code. This not only established a tradition at id, well, at least for a period of time, but it gave birth to one of the most unique and engaged communities in gaming history, and has done a lot to keep Doom alive for the last 30 years. Doom spawned two direct sequels, Doom 2 and Doom 64, the latter of which is my favorite Doom game ever made. I have a long-form video here on the channel all about it. And the franchise's popularity naturally led to some seriously unprecedented anticipation about whatever came next from id. But it's the mid-90s now. Technology was evolving fast, as was the potential for greater visual fidelity in video games. So after Doom 2, Carmack and collaborator Michael Abrash began living on that cutting edge as they developed a new, fully 3D game engine. The sun was setting on the Doom engine's pseudo 3D trickery, and this next engine would mark a new frontier for gaming. The engine, of course, was going to be the new canvas for the studio's next project, Quake, whose title was first referenced in a promotional card included with 1990's Commander Keen, id's episodic side-scrolling platformer series that preceded Wolfenstein. The promo said that the mighty Quake, the name of one of Carmack's Dungeons & Dragons characters, would be the protagonist of a new game called The Fight for Justice. The concept went through various iterations over the years. Third-person fighting and RPG elements were discussed, with Romero being the strongest proponent of moving in a new direction, of creating something very different from Wolfenstein and Doom. At this time, the studio remained small despite its success and lacked a single designated leader. Instead, everything was done by a committee of sorts, but that committee, by 1995-1996, it was splitting at the seams, simultaneously developing a groundbreaking engine and a complex game to run within that engine, frustrated and exhausted everybody at id. Eventually, the decision was made to simplify Quake and have it be more of a spiritual successor to Doom, versus this all-new thing Romero was fantasizing about. He later took a proper stab at this concept with 2000's Daikatana, his much ballyhooed game at his new post-id studio, Ion Storm, and well, the short lifespan of the studio and the way in which the game was drawn and quartered by critics kind of tells you everything you need to know, which, I mean, I have all the respect in the world for Romero, but is why I'm honestly glad Quake became what it became and not, well, this. Carmack, on the other hand, seemed so weird and intense and difficult to work with at this time, but as a fellow co-founder of the studio, he felt Romero wasn't pulling his weight, and perhaps he wasn't. Carmack is extremely driven, and that's why he's been so successful in his career pre and post-id. And it's 1995, and he's just built one of the most groundbreaking video game engines of all time. And he's looking over at Romero, who's maybe a little more preoccupied with his hair and his cars and his fame. And I think Carmack just had enough. When it comes to game developers, these two are the ultimate left brain meets right brain duo. I think Romero needed Carmack, and I also think Carmack needed Romero, and I feel that showed in the games they went on to develop independently after 1996. So after an uneasy but mostly mutual agreement, it was decided Romero would leave id after Quake was complete, and with that, the exhausted team got back to work and slogged toward their new finish line. You know, I have always thought of id a little bit like a 1980s DIY hardcore punk band, like the Black Flag of video game development or something. An unlikely band of misfits who, for a time, captured true lightning in a bottle, but could only contain that electricity for so long. After years of doing everything yourself, writing, recording, producing, promoting, traveling, performing, an inevitable explosion is coming, and you're either going to sell out or break up, and break up id Software did. Quake released in June 1996, the same month as Nintendo's Super Mario 64, and both titles in their own way would change gaming forever. But the damage was done. In addition to Romero, lots of other key id employees left the studio after shipping Quake, like Abrash, Sandy Peterson, Jay Wilbur, Mike Wilson, Sean Green. This makes Quake sort of a swan song. It marked the end of one of the most prolific and influential eras of video game development. Romero went on to do his own thing. Carmack and others continued on at id, like artist Kevin Cloud, who would direct Quake 2, which is a solid, competent FPS game, but in my opinion, lacks a lot of the charm and personality of Quake 1. Doom 3 was a reboot of the Doom franchise, and while it's a solid game and an absolute technical showpiece for 2004, it was a dramatic departure from the classic games and alienated lots of longtime fans, understandably. 2011's Rage was id's first attempt at a new IP in many years, and again, was very polarizing. I guess some people enjoy it, but it was never my thing. It wasn't until the departure of Carmack and the hiring of new creative director Hugo Martin about a decade ago now, when the studio stabilized again and found consistent success. And as much as I enjoy the work the studio's done since then, particularly Doom 2016, there's just some quality about those classic games like Quake that I don't feel id, or any other studio for that matter, has ever been able to match or surpass. So to keep the punk rock analogy rolling, if Wolfenstein was the first 4 years and Doom was damaged, then Quake was certainly my war. Darker, meaner, familiar, sure, but also somehow at the same time stranger and entirely unique. So that covers the game's history and development, but now let's get into the good stuff. The actual meat and gravy, the jibs and slime, if you will. The arsenal, the monsters, the levels of Quake. This is what id said about Quake back in the day, and I couldn't really do any better than this myself. Rage through 32 single-player levels and 6 deathmatch levels of sheer terror and fully immersive sound and lighting. Arm yourself against the cannibalistic ogre, fiendish vor, and indestructible shambler using lethal nails, fierce thunderbolts, and the abominable rocket and grenade launchers. But before we dive too deep into enemies and weapons, I do want to talk about the most important aspect of any video game to me, and that's feel. Movement, what it's like interacting with the game minute to minute, registering inputs controller in hand or behind a mouse and keyboard. Because there's a lot of games out there with cool art direction and interesting enemy designs, but if a game doesn't feel satisfying and fluid and fun to play, I'm probably going to lose interest. Quake is very simple in its presentation. You're Quake guy. You have access to tons of firearms and even a couple melee weapons. Instead of Doom's action or use input, Quake has a jump input, which is far more fun and useful in my opinion. The jump itself is super springy. You can initiate it repeatedly with really no restrictions. Same with running, there's no stamina meter or anything like that. You can run super fast, and compared to Doom, Quake's movement feels a little less floaty, a little more grounded to me, but that probably has a lot to do with the new 3D engine. Like a lot of FPS titles, you can adjust your vertical and horizontal camera or aiming sensitivity as well as your field of view or FOV. Because it's a fast-paced 3D game, you often have enemies closing in on you from all angles, so it's important to have that peripheral vision. You wouldn't want the FOV to be as tight as you might want it in a survival horror game, let's say, like Resident Evil 7. In RE7, the action is slower paced, and with your flashlight, a tighter FOV can actually help you spot details dead ahead, and just generally adds to the immersion of a creepy game full of jump scares. Although Quake has a lot of horror elements too, it's a fast, frenetic game. Things are happening in the blink of an eye. Over the years, I've found my FOV sweet spot is around 110, but lots of players will prefer an even wider perspective. And that's about it. Maybe other than binding inputs to specific buttons or keys, which I really like to do with my favorite weapons, which come in handy during specific combat situations, you just run, jump, shoot, and weapon switch your way through the game's levels. Some levels are pretty straightforward, not too complex, a couple hidden weapon caches and secret passageways, whereas other levels are giant layered mazes, a little more akin to Doom's level design, with multiple locked doors and stashed away keys. At the end of every level, you're measured on 1, how long it took you to reach the endpoint, 2, how many of the enemies you killed, and 3, how many of the secrets you discovered. The game is beautifully simple, yet not simplistic. It's designed in such a way that there's so much creative depth with combat and the enemy AI and even projectile physics that Quake is one of those games that's super easy to pick up and play, but quite difficult to master, especially on the nightmare difficulty. So what about the arsenal? Well, as you might have guessed, it's my favorite arsenal in any FPS game because it's weird. It's different. I mean, I remember back in the day when I first learned that there were guns in Quake that shot nails instead of bullets. Nail guns. I was sold right away. It's so bloody and crazy and sadistic, I love it. And like most id Soft games and most great FPS games, the arsenal isn't just a random collection of guns. They're diverse and purposeful. There's different tools for different jobs. And of course, a staple of the boomer shooter, there's no reloading. There's no fussing or padding at all. Everything is straightforward and streamlined. You start with the standard single barrel shotgun. The Quake game manual calls it the basic gun to which all other guns compare favorably. And while that's kind of true, it is a very useful gun, which in my experience functions a little more like a rifle, honestly, the deeper you get into the game. It's a true hit-scan weapon, which means there's no delay between hitting your trigger input and your round connecting with the enemy in front of you. It's instantaneous, and because it's single barrel, it's super accurate. Early into your playthrough, you collect the double barrel shotgun, an id Software special. And while I don't adore it quite as much as the Doom 2 Super Shotgun, which I do feel is the best shotgun in video game history, it's still a damn good substitute. Because it fires from two barrels, it does have a pretty wide spread, so you'll largely waste ammo at long distances. That's what the single barrel is for. But up close, it's absolutely devastating, even against the game's toughest enemies. But of course, another trade-off is that it eats ammo fast. So it's an essential tool in the game, but one that's best used strategically, not haphazardly. It's got a nice, deep, bassy sound too, which I love, but again, not quite as much as the punchy pop of Doom 2 Super Shotgun. Perhaps the piece de resistance in Quake's arsenal is the unholy nail gun, and it's exactly as advertised, a gun that shoots nails. The best part is it's kind of automatic. It's basically a machine gun that alternates shots between its two barrels. It has perfect accuracy, zero damage fall off, zero recoil, so it's great for mobs, for flying enemies, or just faraway targets. And it's always fun to use. It just feels good. Like, you look forward to being able to brandish it and just spray away. Like the double barrel, it eats ammo fast, so you want to conserve it for when you really need it. And that's part of the combat chest that is Quake, not panicking in combat scenarios and knowing when you can hang on with a simpler weapon versus when you need to bust out the big guns. The nail gun ammo even comes in these unmistakable boxes that feature the logo of 9 Inch Nails, who did the game's soundtrack, but we'll get into that later. Later in your playthrough, you'll collect the super nail gun as well, and oh man. Again, I'll reference the game manual here. The Great Equalizer, 4 cyclic barrels that hose out spikes like crazy. Pro, foes drop like flies. Con, eats ammo like popcorn. Next up is the grenade launcher, which, I don't know, you could make a case against the nail gun here. I wouldn't be mad if someone said, hey, this is actually the most essential weapon in the game. I would say it's perhaps the most dynamic weapon in the base game arsenal, and maybe the most impressive one too. In 1996, it was especially impressive because it's something that just wasn't possible in games that came before it, even Doom. The grenade launcher is a true projectile launcher, blasting out grenades that ricochet all over the place, off floors and ceilings and walls. And because the projectile physics are so impressive in this engine, particularly for the mid-90s, this weapon arguably has the highest skill ceiling. You can do crazy trick shots with the launcher. It's just so versatile. It's honestly about as effective as its user is creative. It's so much fun to experiment with, it never gets old, and it's such an essential tool as you get deeper into a playthrough. That clinky sound effect has to be one of the most iconic sound bites in video game history. When I think of Quake, some of the first images that pop into my mind are of me launching and dodging oncoming grenades. It's something you get very used to the more and more you play Quake. The rocket launcher is exactly what you'd think. Probably the second most effective weapon in the game. Basically, just aim and blast. Again, I'm going to the game manual here. For when a grenade positively, absolutely has to be there on time. In both single player and multiplayer, it's so devastating because while direct hits are most effective, the splash damage potential is wild. You can aim at a wall near a mob of enemies or some level of guaranteed damage. It's definitely a tool you turn to when time is short and danger is imminent. But the coolest aspect of the rocket launcher is that it can double as a violent jetpack of sorts. The rocket jump is one of the more technical mechanics in Quake, but man, it's a game changer when you get comfortable with it. Of course, the biggest risk of using the rocket launcher is its splash damage, potentially blowing yourself up. However, you can leverage the splash damage to your advantage. Essentially, the rocket jump works like this. You aim down at a floor or a wall and time your jump and your shot such that the blast boosts you to high points you'd otherwise be unable to reach. You'll still eat a little splash damage, yes, but this can be such a tricky tactic to deal with, especially in multiplayer, and it can also help you reach secret areas in single player. It's also essential to Quake speedrunning, and the creativity shown off by the community over the years is pretty incredible. And keep in mind, power-ups like quad damage, if enabled during a rocket jump, have the power to throw the player even farther. There's the possibility of combining grenades and rocket jumps, or doing double rocket jumps, say off of a floor and then a wall, for a similar effect. The craziest part about the whole mechanic is that it was accidental. It was an emergent player behavior after release that shocked Romero, who hadn't prepared for it with his original game design. Rocket jumping is certainly one of Quake's more interesting rabbit holes. Finally, we have the Thunderbolt or Lightning Gun, the most powerful weapon in the game. It's powered by cell ammo and fires a continuous beam of electricity that is absolutely devastating. For example, it can drop the dreaded Shambler in 2 seconds flat. And it holds the distinction of being the only weapon in Quake that can shoot through walls. However, if you use it when you're underwater, you'll fry yourself, instant death, which is kind of funny the first time it happens to you. Oh, and we can't forget the axe. Again, we'll go to the manual. The last resort. Face it, going toe-to-toe with the uglies in Quake demonstrates all the good sense of a man parachuting into an alligator farm. It is pretty satisfying to chop grunts up with this thing, but my favorite use for it, especially on Nightmare difficulty, is for opening secret doors so as to not waste any firearm ammo. So that covers it. That's the arsenal of Quake. The DLCs add a few more weapons which we'll touch on later, but this base game lineup is pretty much flawless in my opinion. Everything you could ever want or need in an FPS game. Now let's talk baddies, the targets for your weapons in this game world. First up are the grunts, the very first enemies you encounter. They're your standard shotgun goon. A blast or two will drop them along with a backpack of ammo just for you. Given they're only armed with a shotgun, they offer obvious windows of vulnerability for you to take advantage of. However, a bunch of them in a room together means they'll all be firing and pausing at different cadences, which shouldn't be underestimated. There's also stronger versions of grunts later in the game, enforcers, who are tougher and armed with laser rifles. The game's grunts often have Rottweilers alongside them, like in the very first level of the game, Slipgate Complex. They're quick, somewhat unpredictable, and can do jump attacks which deal extra damage. In Quake's version of combat chess, I typically take them down first before the grunts due to their speed on the chessboard. Their bark definitely inspires fear throughout a playthrough because you so often hear them before you see them, and they can be tricky targets because they're so low and close to the ground, and also because of their jumping ability. But they never have much HP and can be dropped in a shot or two. Next up is the Ogre, my favorite enemy in the game, and favorite enemy ever designed by id Software. You meet one at the very beginning of the game's second level, Castle of the Damned. Mercifully, its back is turned to you, but once you get its attention, the Ogre makes you go, oh, okay, I understand what kind of game I'm playing now. The ogres are 8-foot-tall abominations, one arm outfitted with a chainsaw, the other with a grenade launcher, meaning they're a threat at any distance. Up close, they'll grind you up with just a few swipes, and at a distance, a successfully placed grenade can insta-kill you. What's most interesting about this design is that the ogre pushes you around the map, around the room or hallway you're in. The grenades force you to move at a distance just as the chainsaw does up close. The ogre is the ultimate reminder that you cannot stand still in Quake. Like your enemies, you always need to be running, jumping, and taking the fight back to them. The ogres are real gems on the combat chessboard too, because they vibe so well with literally any other enemy type. I mean, imagine just the 3 enemy types I've covered and only them in a single room. Maybe 4 grunts, 2 rottweilers, and 1 ogre. Maybe there's a bridge in the middle, a couple platforms on the perimeter, boom, there you go. That's a fun 60 seconds right there. Because the AI is so well designed, and because your arsenal of weapons is so well designed, and because the movement and game feel is so free and satisfying, that's the Quake cocktail right there. Next up is the Scrag, which you also encounter in Castle of the Damned along with the Ogre. They're your typical airborne enemy variety, kind of these floating reptilian ghost things. They're not super strong, their ranged attacks don't do a ton of damage, but they're annoying. They're pests. That's their job. Just like the Rottweilers force you to aim down, the Scrags force your attention upward. They're ideal for nail gun target practice. The double barrel shotgun isn't super effective against them. When running low on ammo, try to snipe them with your single barrel. But again, imagine the hypothetical combat room we just talked about. A couple grunts, a couple dogs, an ogre. Now pepper in 2 Scrags up high. Yep, they certainly add tension to the gameplay experience. That's exactly what they're there to do. Even deep in a playthrough, when you're feeling kind of OP and confident, no matter your skill level, when you see a couple of these things float into the picture or troll you from behind, the reaction is always the same. Damn it. The knights are basically melee versions of grunts, your basic foot soldiers, wildly swinging their swords around. They can be a real nuisance in mobs and are faster and have a longer reach than you'd think. Fortunately, they go to sleep quickly. We also have Death Knights, which are regular knights on steroids. In addition to more HP and more deadly melee attacks, they can also cast fireball magic at you, which, like the Ogre's grenade blasts, force you to move. They push you around the map, sometimes in very unwelcomed, uncomfortable ways. The fireballs come out as 6 individual balls of flame, kind of spreading and fanning towards you. They're relatively slow moving, but can do a ton of damage when they connect, and can be difficult to avoid if you're preoccupied with a bunch of Scrags and regular knights and level geometry. Death Knights tend to be my nemesis in a playthrough of the base game. By the end of the game, they're thrown at you pretty liberally, they can get pretty annoying, and they definitely tank a lot of damage. I like to introduce them to my double barrel as swiftly as possible, or a rocket to the face also gets the job done. Fiends are next up. The game manual calls them organic buzzsaws, and that's about right. They are priority number 1 almost any time they hit the chessboard. They're fast, they can jump extreme distances, and if they corner you, well, you're screwed. The ogres first teach you how to move and play defense in Quake, and then the fiends, they're the masterclass in this department. According to John Romero, fiends lack eyes because the fantastic realms that they're native to are dim, humid, and horrific. Thus, eyes would be unnecessary. Lovely. Zombies. Almost forgot about the zombies. On the surface, they're unremarkable little sponges for your ammo, but what's so interesting about them is that they resurrect if you don't jib them or chop them up or blow them up. This is a nasty little surprise the first time you experience it. You think you took care of them, so you turn your attention to other enemies, and before you know it, they're chewing on your backside. Make sure to introduce them to a grenade. Stat. There's rotfishes, gross little guppies found underwater, meaning nowhere is safe on Quake's chessboard. On ground, in the air, underwater, there are always threats. They die fast, but are definitely creepy and cause anxiety when they rush you in a group. Whew, Vors are next up, and if you play Quake, you will die to Vors many times. It's just a rite of passage. They're essentially the game's turrets. They're slow-moving but launch homing projectiles that are absolutely deadly. They're true tanks too, having one of the biggest health pools of any enemy in the game. Again, a top priority whenever they're around, because you can imagine the tension when one of their projectiles, potentially an instant death, is floating your way while you're trying to deal with zombies, 2 Death Knights, who are also blasting you with fireballs. Yeah, Vors instantly make any combat scenario stressful, and for that reason they are always worth targeting with your most powerful weapons. Next up is the big one, Daddy Shambler, another fantastically grotesque design by id Software. Their head only features a fanged mouth. They tower over everything like a Yeti or Bigfoot or something. They'll Hulk smash you at close range with no problem, but they're most dangerous because of their crazy health pool, the largest of any enemy in the game, and their electric beam attacks, which are about as scary as anything you'll encounter. They can snipe you from any distance with near perfect accuracy, and the damage per second is insane. Whenever possible, you want to make use of level geometry and try to keep some kind of obstacle between you and the shambler. Take advantage of their small windows of vulnerability and launch a rocket, a grenade, or feed them some of their own medicine with the thunderbolt. Even a death by double-barrel shotgun or super nail gun is quite satisfying. I absolutely love the sadistic nature of the PlayStation trophy, a close shave, which requires you to take down a shambler with only your axe. That's a fun one. These guys are the barons of hell, the cyber demons of Quake, the biggest, baddest things the devs have to throw at you. And last, but certainly not least, oh god, it makes my palms sweat even having to talk about them. Spawns. They're the worst. They're the worst thing in the game. Maybe the worst thing in any game ever. Imagine a nuclear bomb, but as a bouncy ball. Once a spawn sees you, they do not relent. They fling themselves at you, disgustingly doing damage every time they connect until you die or they die. And even once you kill them, which isn't easy, it requires some real marksmanship. They explode, and that explosion can kill you instantly too. They're just, ugh. If you don't have spawn PTSD, you have not played Quake enough. Oh, and there's a few unique DLC enemies, but I don't feel any of them are that essential. Other than maybe the Gremlin, I like them. They eat corpses and steal your guns. I should also mention there's monster infighting in Quake, which is a fun touch and can mix things up. All monsters emit some kind of audio cue when they aggro on you too, which is not only smart design, but these groans and grumbles become so deeply ingrained in your brain the more and more you play. I swear I've heard ogres in my sleep. Alright, so we've covered movement, weapons, and enemies. Now let's talk about the levels, the campaign, the game itself. So in Quake, the Ranger, Quake guy, you, is sent into a portal to try and stop an enemy codenamed, you guessed it, Quake. We learn a government experiment with teleportation or slipgates has gone wrong, and otherworldly forces commanded by the All-Mother, the witch goddess, Quake herself, whose real name, a Lovecraftian term, is one I'm just not comfortable saying out loud in a video whose digital footprint will outlive me. Her forces are invading the human realm, testing humanity through violence, and you, the Ranger, take the fight back to the monsters, teleporting yourself across almost 40 maps, grouped into 4 episodes which feature themed levels, base maps, medieval maps, and runic maps. There's of course a multiplayer deathmatch too. Quake was so influential in pioneering an online multiplayer back in the day. I have heard people say they think Quake's campaign sucks and the game is only good for its multiplayer. I completely disagree, while also respecting that Quake's multiplayer is awesome, still fun, and historically important to gaming. No one would deny that. But when we're talking campaigns, I think I would rather play this campaign than the campaigns in Doom 1, Doom 2, Quake 2, even Doom 64. When you mix in the DLC maps, community-created maps, yeah, Quake is a really, really rich PvE experience. I've heard some people question or even complain about the difficulty select map. I mean, instead of selecting your difficulty on a menu screen like you do in Doom, you actually traverse into a portal within a 3-dimensional space, and I love this. Why anyone is confused or irritated by this baffles me. It introduces you to the world and the art direction, the textures, and most importantly, the feel, moving through 3D space. It's a technical showpiece. It's Carmack and Romero in 1996 showing off their work. And I always loved how if you want to choose hard difficulty, you do have to platform over to the portal. There's this minimum barrier that you must hurdle if you want to play the game at this level. And the nightmare difficulty is even deeper buried, sort of as a secret within this difficulty select map. Again, a reminder that you're not ready for nightmare if you can't solve this one platforming puzzle. The maps are also different in part because, as we discussed earlier, id Soft was breaking up at this point like a classic rock band or something. There were a lot of disagreements about the direction of the successor to Doom, and different people on the dev team worked on different parts of the game. And while the end result could have been a mess, I think it's actually a pretty cohesive experience, this fusion of sci-fi and fantasy full of body horror and lots of Lovecraft influence. The levels are less convoluted and complex than the levels in Doom 1 and Doom 2, yet I don't feel that's a bad thing. Classic Doom, as much as I adore it, can be a little tedious at times. For my taste, Quake offers up ideal levels that are anywhere from 5 to 10 or 20 or sometimes closer to 30 minutes in length, but they never really overstay their welcome. There's a couple maps in Doom 2 that I feel are guilty of this, and this was one of my bigger complaints about Doom Eternal, particularly the master levels. They're just too damn long to me. I get bored with them. In Quake, as soon as you get tired of a space base, you're back in a runic level. As soon as you get tired of a runic level, you're back in a medieval level. It keeps things fresh in my opinion. The campaign ends up being a really nice length, not too short, not too long, with some nice secret levels too. Some of my very favorite levels include, in Chapter 1, Slipgate Complex, Castle of the Damned, and Gloom Keep. In Chapter 2, the Ogre Citadel, the Wizard's Manse. In Chapter 3, the Wind Tunnels and the Haunted Halls. In Chapter 4, the Tower of Despair, the Elder God Shrine, the Pain Maze, and Azure Agony. These are a lot of Romero's and Sandy Peterson's levels, and there's a ton more I really enjoy. There's only a few maps in the game I don't love. Romero designed the best levels in Doom 1, but was kind of AWOL for Doom 2. That's probably why Carmack was so fed up with it. It's fairly uncontroversial to say the Doom 1 maps are better designed overall, but Doom 2 obviously has the super shotgun and better enemy variety, so it's a bit of a stalemate between the two. But Quake? Damn, Romero was back in full force, and his horseshoe design philosophy is on full display across the episodes. It's this simple yet profound idea that in video games with player movement, straight lines are boring, but so are circles. So Romero favors a horseshoe layout where the level kind of turns in on itself and remains unpredictable. Horseshoes also tend to make secrets and shortcuts more exciting too. As a gamer, once this shape becomes ingrained in your mind, you start seeing it everywhere, intentionally or unintentionally. For example, many of From Software's best designed Soulsborne levels, you guessed it, feature horseshoes. The worlds in these old Carmack games are so solid too because he tortured every detail, and the pixels are perfect, the textures are perfect, there's basically no inaccuracies, no shimmering, no cracks in the work. The bouncing grenades in Quake are a great showpiece for such a pivotal 3D game, but at the same time they reinforce the solidity of the world as they bounce off of walls and ceilings and floors. The worlds in Carmack's old game engines, as stylized and silly as they can be, still feel so immersive and believable. You really can't take this kind of craftsmanship, let's call it, for granted. The color palette of Quake is really dialed into. Lilac purple with pops of tangerine and marmalade reddish orange and a soft banana yellow. Lots of earth tones, rusty browns, and slaty grays. I think the palette is brilliantly dialed, but some people do gripe about it being quote-unquote all brown. Well, apparently the reliance on earth tones had a lot to do with the engine's new light maps. The team was working with a limited number of color gradients, and the priority was nice shadows and dynamic lighting versus, I don't know, featuring all of the colors of the rainbow. It reminds me of when people complain that Bloodborne is too dark, too black, when in reality there's lots of meaningful pops of color all over the game. And the darkness helps create an atmosphere that I would argue is critical to the player's experience. Like with so many elements of old school game design, music, visuals, heck, storage space, technological limitations often bred creative innovation. And on top of all of that, you have the Trent Reznor soundtrack. Getting Reznor to do the soundtrack of their sci-fi fantasy FPS game in 1996 is about the hippest thing ever, and Reznor totally delivered. The theme song is very Nine Inch Nails, while most of the other tracks are much more along the lines of ambient soundscapes, somewhat like what Aubrey Hodges did with Doom 64 and the PlayStation ports of Doom 1 and 2. Side note, Hodges is also the musical artist for Quake 64, the Nintendo 64 port of the game, and as classic as some of Bobby Prince's Doom music is, some of it is kinda silly and cheesy too. Don't get me wrong, I enjoy it, but this soundtrack, it's genuinely creepy. It genuinely adds to the atmosphere of this game, the atmosphere that the id Soft team was trying to build. There are two proper boss battles in the Quake campaign, and I'm always pretty mixed on FPS boss battles, even in a game like Doom Eternal where I know the team did their damnedest to make polished, fleshed out boss battles. I just find them tedious and annoying, and they kind of kill the momentum in my opinion. There's Chthon, this big lava dude at the end of Chapter 1. I suppose the level presents an interesting little combat puzzle, but it's definitely not a highlight of the game for me. And then at the very end of the campaign, the final level, you descend into Quake's pit to defeat the Hell Mother herself. It's really intense on Nightmare, tons of ads, a pretty brutal run-up to a teleporter that you use to telefrag the boss. I don't know, it's pretty gimmicky and silly. But you do get a nice little message about how you are the master now and the team at idsoft salutes you. It is a pretty memorable moment looking back on it. There are a few DLC bosses that offer more enjoyable fights, like Armagon and the Dragon, the latter of which was a boss the id team originally concepted and wanted in the base game. And as we think about the level design and the qualities of this game world itself, I gotta note that Quake did a lot to advance speedrunning culture too, and as you can imagine, between bunny hops and rocket jumps, the potential for speed in Quake is insane. Just YouTube some footage if you're curious, or specifically, dig into Quake Done Quick. QDQ is a series of speedrunning videos going back to the 90s in which multiple speedrunners work together to absolutely blitz through the levels. I mean, we're talking about beating the game on Nightmare in like 12 minutes. Truly next level stuff. It was actually this kind of QDQ footage that inspired me to start speedrunning games like Dark Souls 3 and Bloodborne back in 2017. In terms of ports and DLC, there's a lot of versions of Quake, just as there's lots of versions of all of the classic id games. Quake 64 was my first experience with the game many years ago, and I still love and stand by it. It has a lot of notable and interesting differences to the base game, which makes it very worthwhile. Different level geometry, a different color palette. A lot of that is due to the limitations of the N64 console and its game cartridges, but in the end, it's seriously worth your time if you're a Quake fan. It's a really cool retro experience. Quake 64, even today, is just meant to be played on a CRT with dithering and all kinds of nostalgic filters and effects. If you've never played it before, think of it as a remix or alternate version of the game and you'll have plenty of fun. 2 DLC episodes released after the base game back in 1997. The only bummer is they weren't developed by id, because id had exploded at this point and was kind of restructuring and reorganizing for their next projects, under the leadership of Carmack and other veterans like Kevin Cloud. The first DLC was developed by Hypnotic Software and is called The Scourge of Armagon. If you love Quake, you'll have fun with it. It's a little too Quake 2 for me at times, a little too space base heavy. It's missing some of that cosmic fantasy charm of the base game, but it does have nice moments. The second DLC, The Disillusion of Eternity, is full of that stuff, and I enjoy it a lot more. It was made by Rogue Entertainment. Both DLCs add some new weapons and ammo, none of which are essential to the experience, but can be pretty fun to play around with, like the lava nails and this giant warhammer. But my favorite official expansion for Quake is Dimension of the Machine, developed by Machine Games of later Wolfenstein fame. They're brilliantly designed levels by pro game designers who are also huge Quake fans. Good enemy placement, some really cool assets like these windmills. There's even a really atmospheric hub you use to travel between the different maps. This released alongside Night Dive's Quake Remaster back in 2021, and I think because it's still pretty fresh to me, when I pick up Quake these days, it's the official map pack I'm most tempted to hop into. Machine Games also developed an official 20th anniversary DLC pack back in 2016 called Dimension of the Past. It's solid enough, not nearly as polished as Dimension of the Machine in my opinion, but it's more Quake and that's never a bad thing. Outside of the official content, the Quake community is still so alive and well. People are still building and sharing awesome map packs. There's even goofy stuff like Q-Doom, which is the first episode of Doom, but rendered in the Quake engine with your choice of Doom enemies or Quake enemies or a mix of both. That was developed by Antonio Gonzalez, known as Drew God, who also had a hand in developing the Doom mod Bloom, which is a crossover of Blood and Doom. Very cool. When it comes to map building, I've always wanted to dabble myself, to be honest. I love Mario Maker and things like that. It's just so time consuming, but that's why it's done by people who really love this game and community and want to contribute something themselves. Hopefully this video and discussion about all the pieces and parts that make up this game have you realizing what a rich treasure chest this is to play with. Night Dive and Bethesda have brought a playlist of fan favorite community maps to console for the first time too, which is really cool, like Honey and Punishment Due. And of course, if you're playing on PC, PC, you have limitless access to community content. A couple great resources if you're interested include the Quake Mapping Discord, a website called Quadicted, and the website Slipseer. All those links are down in the description if you're interested in getting involved and downloading some great content. As you can imagine, the community still buzzing almost 3 decades after the game's release means there's always something fresh to play. It's kind of endless and overwhelming, honestly. And that's on top of the base game and the 4 official expansions now. Because of the massive changes within id Software, Quake was never really the same again after 1996. Quake 2, which dropped in late 1997, as I said earlier, is a very competent FPS game, but it is a full sci-fi, space-based kind of thing. It feels a lot more claustrophobic and uninspired in my opinion than Quake 1, but still has great gameplay and some really fun weapons. The levels are just far too long for my taste and have way too many enemies. The game just becomes really repetitive and tedious for my taste. And it's only a sequel in name. The story and world are totally different than Quake 1. 1999's Quake 3 is a pure online multiplayer game, Quake Arena, another important, influential gaming experience, but I've always been craving more single-player Quake, more curated maps and enemies and weapons and stuff like that. Quake 4, out in 2005, developed by Raven, not id Software, does offer a single-player experience, but oddly enough, it's a direct sequel to Quake 2, which, as I said, has no connection whatsoever to Quake 1. Quake 2 is really only a sequel in name. It's a spiritual sequel, I guess. In Quake 4, I don't know. Again, I wouldn't call it a bad game, but to me it feels very cheesy, kind of derivative of Halo and Call of Duty. It has that macho, bro-y military vibe to it. Nothing at all like Quake 1. And then you have Quake Champions, which released exclusively on PC in 2017 and is a multiplayer-only game, much like Quake 3, and does have really fun gameplay. But yeah, it's just not what I'm personally looking for from Quake these days. I also feel like a console release for Quake Champions would have gone a long way to just keeping Quake more top of mind in the gaming world. To me, it feels like at id Software today, Hugo Martin and his team have taken their Doom reboot project about as far as they can. And I'm actually very partial to Doom 2016 over Eternal, but after Eternal and all of its bells and whistles, I personally hope they drop the IP and go back to Quake and give it that 2016 treatment. I want them to go back to their roots and re-examine and pick apart all the great ingredients in Quake 1 and give us a next-gen 120 FPS Quake game that meshes fantasy with sci-fi, that's full of body horror and nail guns. That's my dream for the studio, and what I've hoped they've been doing in secret for these last couple years. And maybe Quake's 2021 remaster is a sign that, yes, something's coming, that Bethesda and id have not forgotten about Quake. So until that happens, if that happens, we're left with what we have, and fortunately Quake 1 has never been more affordable or more accessible. And look, I'm a big sympathizer with ex-modern Doom composer Mick Gordon and detest the way he alleged Marty Stratton and some of the Bethesda ZeniMax suits treated him. And generally, I don't like the kind of games that come out of this corporation, and sort of think as fun and impressive as Doom Eternal can be as a first-person shooter, that the studio I once loved and admired, yeah, it doesn't exist anymore, and may actually be a toxic corporate hellhole. I don't know, it's anyone's guess. We're not inside the place. But I felt the need to state the obvious here. I love looking back and remembering the good times and good games, but I'm unsure how psyched I'll be supporting the studio moving forward. I'm sure I won't be able to resist playing their next game, but I'm sensitive to this corporate abuse stuff, and I don't think I'm going to get over this Marty Stratton thing. Carmack has said he feels Doom 1993 is the most perfect game they made at id, and perhaps it is, and I wouldn't push back on someone if they said, hey, Doom is just more polished and cohesive than Quake. Sure, I get it. But to me, the ceiling is just so much higher in the Quake engine, literally and figuratively. The movement, the speed, the skyboxes, the physics, the arsenal, the monsters, the art direction. Overall, there's lots of reasons why I personally prefer it, while still remaining a huge Doom fan. If you own the game, I hope this big retrospective discussion has inspired you to go pick it back up yourself. And if you don't own the game, well, I hope this has inspired you to pick it up and give it a go for the first time. It is no doubt my desert island FPS game, and I can only hope that id brings it back in earnest sooner rather than later. Now I want to hear from you. Go down into the comments and tell me, what do you think about Quake? What are your memories with this game? Your favorite levels, your favorite enemies? Are you also hoping, fingers crossed, that id Software is going to reboot the franchise? Remember that you can keep this conversation going over in my Discord server, Terapop's Treehouse. You can also unlock more bonus content from me every month, along with a huge archive of exclusive newsletters and podcasts over at patreon.com/Terapop. And of course, subs and likes here on the channel are always appreciated. If you enjoyed this video, I have a very similar video on the channel about Doom 64, as I already mentioned, its history, my personal experiences with the game, and I've also recorded a podcast with Amorpher, a well-known figure in the Doom community. We talk Doom, Quake, map making, dark ambient music, so feel free to go check those out. But as always, thank you for watching, and hopefully,
I'll catch you in the underworld.